The Lord is near to all who call on him. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. In the sanctuary of solitude are the gathering of many. In whisper or shout, he is near.
Good morning. It's good to be back here at Bethel. Our family's been out of town for the last couple of Sundays. We've been doing some short trips on the weekend, so it's good to be back. And if you happen to be a first-time visitor this morning, the good news is I'm not the regular preacher, so, come back next week and you'll probably get a whole different thing and it'll be a lot better. All right, so I think I've driven Adam crazy this week. He's trying to keep up with me. I sent him in the notes for the bulletin, forgot to give him the blank, so he had no idea where the sermon was really going. So he had to work with that. He came up with that and that, which was perfect even without the blanks. I finally sent him in the blanks. And so I've kind of driven him crazy this week. But sometimes things don't work out the way we kind of plan. Because I got my text, I got my sermon, got everything going together Wednesday night, put in the outline, sent it to Adam, without the blanks, of course. I already mentioned that. Thursday night, sat down and kind of had my notebook, wrote out point one, so I was about 2/3 of the way through, ready to go. Friday, kind of hit a roadblock. Couldn't really come up with getting a good start on point two there. And then Saturday morning, the Lord told me to do something entirely different. It's going to be still the same text, still got the same great title, Come and See the Man, Jesus, but it's a different way than I had planned it, so I don't really know what I'm doing at the moment. Last week, I didn't expect to be sitting here. I don't know why I'm sitting here, but that's kind of what I felt led to do, is be sitting here at the moment preaching and saying and giving you what is Lord's, hopefully, the right thing. And so here we go. It's all talk about expectations, You probably weren't expecting me to come up here and sit down either. Usually here at Bethel, for you who are visitors, we have a sermon table we use. I don't even think it's up here on this platform this morning. It's over there. I just couldn't see it because I'm blind and old. But anyway, so usually toward the end of the thing, somebody comes up and moves the table. Usually it's either Logan or Chandler. Somebody comes and puts out the table in the center, moves the stands back and all that, and here we go. And so we all have expectations in life. And if you read ahead in your bulletin there, you see that the text is from John chapter 4, verse 28, 29. And you might remember that's the story of the woman at the well. And that's already been acted out pretty well by some folks. I think it was Chandler and Kendall, wasn't it? Acted out a few months back. So you might remember some of that. But it's a little different take than the way I had it in the notes. So if the note takers weren't already hating me before, they're definitely hating me now. As you can see, I'm a little clumsy. All right, so John chapter 4. And we're going backwards, of course. 28 and 29. So the woman left her water pot and went into the city and said to the men, "Come see a man who told me all the things that I have done. This is not the Christ, is it? Come and see the man." We have certain expectations. Probably when you heard the title, you had expectations of how the sermon was going to go, and, well, frankly, so did I. But it doesn't always work out that way. Jesus sometimes surprises us. If we read this whole story, pretty much everybody in the story except Jesus got their expectations turned on their heads. He turned the expectations of a whole town on their heads, basically, by what he did and the way things have happened. The people reading the story for the first time in the book of John, they know we've had the Bible around for a long time now, and most everybody in here has probably read this story or heard this story before. But if you were somebody years ago, centuries ago, hearing this story for the first time, Again, hearing the story would have turned what you expected to happen on your heads, because there are signs of things that are supposed to happen in the story, and it just don't happen that way. So here we go. All right, so the woman at the well, she got her expectations turned on her head. She woke up that morning, she probably didn't expect anything unusual to happen. Now, there's something you need to know about wells. You may already know it, but if you've never heard this or don't know this, a well was kind of like a singles bar back in the day, in those days. That's where people went to meet their prospective spouses. And if you remember the story, the parable of the lost coin, it's in the same chapter, same place in Luke as the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. We often call that parable the prodigal son. They took their dowries with them. The coin that she lost that she was looking for in that parable was one of the coins from her dowry. They kind of like, I don't know, they had some kind of bracelet or belt or something. I don't know exactly how it worked, that they would use. So, I mean, going to a well, it meant you were looking for, it was kind of like synonymous with looking for a spouse. If you think back to the Old Testament, they found Rebekah at a well for Isaac, the servant that Abraham sent. Jacob met Rachel at the well. So that's like, it's a common thing, something you expect to happen. Like for those of you who are old enough to watch Western movies a lot back in the day, the guy in the white hat's always the good guy, right? And it's dangerous to be the sidekick. We all know that, right? All right. So that's kind of the thing. It's an expectation. All right. But the time for going to the well was in the evening, later in the day. Probably because, well, one, the work is done, and two, it's cooler because besides looking for your spouse, you also got to get to water, because that's where the water came from back then. All right? So you're looking for that. You're looking for the water, and you're looking for the person, the spouse that you might be going to spend the rest of your life with, and it goes from there. All right? So those kind of expectations. Well, the woman at the well, it said, and if you read the whole story, we're not going to go back and read the whole thing, but if you go back and read it, you'll find that Jesus was sitting at the well at the 6th hour. That's like the middle of the day. That's like high noon. All right? High noon is not when you're supposed to meet your girlfriend. That's a whole other kind of movie, if you're old enough. Y'all don't know about that. It was a Western, all right? Okay? But other things are supposed to happen at high noon, but not that. You know, you're not expecting people to come to the well. They come to the well in the evening. But the woman at the well, she was an outcast. All right? We'll find out why later in the story. But she was coming at the wrong time to the well. She was trying to avoid people. Or either that or the people that told her they didn't want her around anyway and told her she couldn't come then. One of the two. The Bible doesn't say which. All right? So she was coming to the well at the wrong time. She wasn't expecting anybody to be there. Probably that was her routine. She'd been doing that every day for a long time. You know, she wasn't expecting anybody to be there. She got there. She found Jesus. All right? Didn't know who he was at the time. Didn't know he was Jesus. Didn't know who he was. Didn't know he was the Son of God, didn't know anything about him, just some guy sitting at the well, which is incredibly unusual. Second thing about that is the guy sitting at the well, Jesus was Jewish. He was not a Samaritan. The Samaritans and the Jews didn't like each other. It's kind of like Virginia Tech and Virginia. They didn't like each other much, all right? So they wouldn't be hanging out talking to each other. They wouldn't be buddies. But actually, most of the time, the way Jesus went, he was going from Galilee to Jerusalem, and the path that most Jews wouldn't even go that way. They go the long way around. It'd be like going through, I don't know, be going down to Christiansburg and going back up through Craig County to get to Roanoke or something instead of just going up 81. They disliked the Samaritans so much that they would go all the way around and do that instead of just going straight through. So they had those expectations there. You know, she was an outcast. She was somebody who was lonely, probably. She was not somebody of high standing in the community. She was an outcast. And she sees Jesus, and you remember the story. Chandler acted it out well. I'm not going to put him on the spot and get him to come do it again. All right, but, you know, he asked for a drink. He asked for water. And then she said something back to him. He said, well, if you knew who it was that was asking you, you would, well, she actually asked him about the whole Jewish Samaritan thing. And she said, if you knew who it was who was asking you, you know, you'd ask me for water. Then she got a little snarky. The Bible doesn't, you have to like look at it close, but she's a little snarky about it. She said, how you going to get water? you don't have anything to draw it with. You ain't got a cup, you ain't got a pitcher, you ain't got anything. You know, she's like being all sarcastic. Maybe, you know, maybe she thought the guy was crazy. We don't know. It doesn't say. So anyway, and he goes on to tell, if you knew who I was, you'd ask me for the living water. All right? Well, the woman at the well, she's still focused on just getting her water and going back to the house, right? So she's thinking, that sounds like a good idea. That way I don't want to walk all the way out here, because water's heavy. You put it in a big old pot like that, because you seem like in some of the pictures, probably like a big gallon pot. You know, it's not like not like one of those little Fetties that Josh got there, or Yetis. Yeah, it's not nothing like that. It's like, you know, big old thing, you know, about a gallon of water, something like that. Sorry, put you on the spot there, man. And I called you the wrong name, didn't I? I did. Yep. Yeah, sorry, man. All right. So anyway, it's not like it was a big thing. It was heavy. And plus, she's going in the middle of the day, high noon, it was hot. You know, so she's thinking, man, if I can just get that water like that, then I won't have to come back anymore. So then, keep having a conversation. And so then, when she asked him for it, he's like, go get your husband. And she said, I don't have one. And in the paraphrase, he basically said, you got that right, sister. Because he said you've had 5 husbands. So that's when the sin came out, you know. We got our notes, and the note takers are hating me. But there was a point, number 1 up there, that said, we are all sinners. That's how I wrote it. Yep, we are all sinners. All right, that's number 1 in your notes. All right, we are all sinners. And because we are all sinners, a lot of times we get the idea that Jesus is far away. All right, we get the idea that he can't come to us. As a matter of fact, we kind of get this. A lot of folks have a picture of Jesus and of God. The God's this kind of angry God. The God like enjoys sending people to hell. It's kind of like the false gods in the Greek mythology, Zeus throwing lightning bolts at people out to get them, waiting for you to screw up so that they can punish you. That's kind of the idea that a lot of times people get. You know, we think, I'm not good enough. You know, I've done too much. I can't come to Jesus. I can't go there because my sin is too great. The things I've done are too great. I'm too much of an outcast, or I'm just not good enough. All right? So we got that going. And that's kind of the picture that people get of God. You know, that's not the biblical picture of God, but that's the picture we get, that he's just an angry God who wants to punish people and have things go like they in that direction. All right? So it came out. The sin came out because Jesus knew. Just like he knows all our sins. He knows my sins. He knows your sins. He knows everybody's sins. You can't go anywhere that God isn't. He knows the things we've done. He knows all about us. He knows where we fall short. He knows the things we think. He knows things that we don't want anybody to know. Jesus doesn't need Facebook because he knows what happens in the 15 minutes before you took the picture. You know, you go on Facebook, you got all these, you see all these nice pictures of my kids. I'm going to put them on the spot a little bit, smiling and smiling. But see, Jesus saw like that. Yeah, Jesus saw the snarkiness and the eye rolls for the 15 minutes before we got that shot. Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of how it is, all right? So, but then, it didn't really become an issue, though. They didn't talk about her sin, you know? Even when he said, when he let her know that he knew all about it, she didn't even ask about it. She didn't even ask about, like, what he thought about it or anything like that. She asked him about a totally different question. She asked him where was the right place to worship and went into another. She said, I perceive you're a prophet. And asked him about a totally different question about where should we worship, which place, here on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You remember the story, lots of you, all right? And so she's still thinking kind of in like an earthly manner, you know. Maybe this guy, we'll see what he says about that, you know. All right, so he says, he surprises her again, turns her expectations on her head. He says, you know, it doesn't really matter. The day is coming when we will worship in spirit and in truth, and it's not really important whether it's in Jerusalem or here. You know, they had expectations. You know, the Jews had expectations that worship was supposed to be a certain way, and the Samaritans had expectations it was supposed to be a different certain way. Jesus turned all that on his head. Not that he just got rid of all of it, you know, helter-skelter and all that, but the important stuff was what's inside, what's in the heart. You know, he talked about that. All right? And so once he said that, then she asked about the Messiah. And he said, I am he. I am the Messiah. I am the Christ. All right? Now we get to somebody else gets their expectations turned on their head. All right? So, at this point, the disciples show up. And they're like kind of surprised because they know the whole well thing, right? You know, they knew all about the well and like what's supposed to go on at the well and what time all that stuff's supposed to happen at the well and all that. And they show up at the well in the 6.5 hour probably, or the 7th hour. I don't know how long exactly they've been talking. And so they look, they see, there's Jesus talking to a woman. They don't know what's going on. They don't know what's going on. They're surprised. They don't know what to think about it. They don't know what to make of it. It's confusing. All right? So, but they're all scared to ask him because he's Jesus, right? You know, you read that a couple times in the Bible where they're like, what's he doing? But they kind of knew who he was already, so they were scared to ask him. You know, so they didn't say anything. Then at that point, that's when we get to the part where the woman left her water pot and goes into the city that we read already. All right, so now we're back caught up. Which brings us kind of to number 2 in our notes. God loves us anyway. Remember, number 1, we are all sinners. Number 2 in the notes, God loves us anyway. All right? Jesus was well aware of the sin. He addressed it in his own way, let her know, didn't ignore it, but he moved on from there. Just like we have the ability to move on from our sin and come to God. All right? So that's how it happens. And we don't know exactly where that change took place. Because the Bible doesn't tell us what was going on inside the woman's mind. It only records her conversation. We don't know what she was thinking, what she was feeling through all of this. We only have the words that she said. So we don't know exactly the moment, the exact moment that it happened, that the change was made. But a change was made. She answered the question in her own mind, is this the Christ? Is this the Messiah? Before she answered it. She had a change of heart and a change of priority. You can tell that for one thing. The first words of verse 28, did I say the right number? Yeah. 28 are, she left her water pot. She left her water pot and went back to the city. Remember, she came to the well to get water. Because even though she was an outcast, she still had to come get water. And so she was trying to avoid the scene of the community. But she still had to get water, and that was her primary thing for life. Water was important there because it was scarce in that region of the country in that time. It was hard to get. You had to walk. The well was not in the village. She had to come out the village, as did all the villagers. And water was the most important thing. One of your most prized possessions would probably be your water pot. That's how you survive. That's how you live. That's how you make your way in the world. Without water, you can't survive. It'd be like a teenager losing their cell phone today. All right? It's very important. It was the thing. It was the thing that she was focused on, was that water. Somewhere, sometime, somehow, during that conversation, when she came to see Jesus, she changed her mind. Her priorities changed. And the water from the well wasn't important anymore. The thing that became to be important was, in fact, the water that came from Jesus. It was Jesus himself. It was God. Following him. That's the thing that became important. We don't know exactly what moment in that conversation, but we can tell from the fact that she left the water pot, the thing that had been one of the most important things that the average person would have had at that time in that area of the world, and went back into town without it to tell others about the change that she had had in her life. You see, that's another way that expectations get turned on their head, because she didn't have to come see Jesus. Jesus came to see her. That's the great message of the gospel, is that we don't have to come see Jesus, even though we have to take some steps. And after we take those steps, we have to go on a long journey. Jesus comes to us. In the first chapter of John, it says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." This is just one of the stories in the book of John that tells us what that looks like. It turns a lot of expectations on his head. And if you go back and you can read the Greek, which I really can't, but I can read about people who can. All right? When it says the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, it has the idea of pitching a tent, putting up a tent, hanging out with us where we are. All right? Not just some kind of easy, like, fly through on the private jet kind of thing. Jesus came down and dwelt with us and stayed with us where we are. He came to us so that we could see him. All right? We still have to take steps, but he came to the woman on the well, and then she went back into the town, the outcast, the last person you'd expect. You know, before Jesus came, people were looking for the Messiah. The Jews were looking for the Messiah. The Samaritans were looking for the Messiah. They expected the Messiah to be a certain way. They would have expected him to go to the leaders of the village. They expected him to go to the people in the gate of the city, because that's where all the court stuff happened back then. All right? That's the people they would have expected Jesus to go to talk to. Jesus came to the outcast. Jesus came to the one that nobody else wanted to be around, who was staying away from people, who was looking to be at the places everybody was at times when they weren't. Roughly going to the well in the middle of the day is kind of like the equivalent of going to Kroger at 12 o'clock at night, if there's one that stays open that late, so you don't have to see anybody. All right, so that's the person that Jesus came to, and it changed the life of a whole village. Because once the woman from the well went back to the town and told them what happened, they came out and they saw Jesus, and they made their own decision. And it changed the lives of a lot of people in that town. Probably turned the whole town on its ears. Because once you see Jesus, you can't ever be the same again. Things have to change if you make that decision. All right? So the takeaway so far is a quote from A.W. Tozer. And again, the note-taking people are hoping I never preach again. Jesus Christ knows the worst about you. Nonetheless, he is the one who loves you the most. Jesus Christ knows the worst about you. Nonetheless, he is the one who loves you the most. All right? Turns all the expectations on our heads. He knows all about our sin. He knows who we are. He knows our shortcomings. He knows the things about us that nobody else knows. But he still loves us that much. He still loves us enough to leave heaven, to come to earth in order to save us so that we can spend eternity in heaven. He loved and cared for us that much. And because he did that, we all have a decision to make, which is number 3 in your notes. We all have a decision to make. Once we see Jesus, once he tells us who he is, we all have to decide who he is. We have a decision to make. You know, in John 10, later on, Jesus says, I am the gate, or I am the door for the sheep. Anyone who tries to come in, all who came before me were robbers. And the only way in, the only way to salvation, the only way to heaven is through that gate, through that door. You know? Jesus is the only path. Later on, a couple of chapters later in chapter 14, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. Now, back in those days, when you heard the word, now a lot of times when you hear that verse, it's preached about just in the same way as coming through the door. But back in those days, a way was a road. If you heard the word way, you think about being on the road. And you're like a Roman road. It's kind of like I-81. All right? So Jesus said, I am the road, the truth, and the life, as much as the way. So he is the gate, and he is the road. And that's why we all have a decision to make every day. Because if you've never given your heart to Christ, if you've never given your heart to Jesus, if you've never done that the first time, then you haven't come through the gate. You haven't come through the door. And that's the first thing you have to do. But after you come through the gate and you're in the door, that's not the end of it. It's a long road. Sometimes the road is easy. Sometimes the road is hard. If you've been a Christian for very long, you know that. If you're not a Christian, you have friends who are, ask them, they can tell you. You know, sometimes the way is hard. It's not that easy. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's as easy as breathing. Sometimes it seems like you can't take another step. But every day, we have a decision to make. We have to choose Jesus every single day, in every single decision, which is hard. And I'm preaching to myself as much as anybody else because I don't always do that. I fall short, and I don't listen to him like I should, and I don't come to him like I should every day. But that's what we should be doing. That's what we need to do. Adam put it really well in the, if you have Facebook and looked at the blurb, I don't know what you call it. The post, yeah, the post. There you go, the post. All right. If you looked at the post about this morning's service, you know, he put it really well. You know, every decision, every day, we always have to choose Jesus. Because the minute we don't, that's when things start to unravel. Sometimes, even when you do, it might seem like things are unraveling. But the good news of the gospel is God's got that too. You know, even if you're choosing Jesus, it may seem like things are unraveling, and it may look like to the world that you're defeated. It may look like you've been beaten. It may look like you've lost. But God has your back, and he has that too. You know, the greatest victory in the history of the world was when Jesus died on the cross and rose again. But on Friday, it looked like a defeat. Even to the point that when he rose again and was walking with some of his followers on the road to Emmaus, they thought it was a defeat. They felt defeated. Even so, God still had their back, and God is in control. But we have a decision to make. We have to choose Jesus every single day because he is the one who loves us the most.